sorry if you had come to hear about glass haze, but change of subject entirely is looking at animal maiming. So this was part of my MA in history, and I'm currently doing a PhD at Southampton University, but I just wanted to share some of this with you. On Tuesday, the 20th of September, 1748, John West of God's Hill Wood in the New Forest discovered that 2 horses and 3 beasts belonging to him had been stabbed, so that they all died on the Saturday morning. This situation had arisen after West had given evidence in the Swainmote Court, Lyndhurst, which had convicted 11 men from Wood Green for cutting trees and stealing timber. In a letter outlining the details of the case, Joseph Hinksman, the Woodward, reported to the Lord Warden that Wood Green is a part of the forest and every house there a trespass, and all the inhabitants live by pilfering and stealing out of the forest. The New Forest residents at this time were indeed made to suffer a poor reputation, and certainly there were squatter communities, as Sylvia mentioned yesterday in her presentation, that had encroached upon places like Wood Green, Castle Malwood and East Boulder, but they were not necessarily the trespassers and vagabonds who live by depredation and are ever ready to break out into open insurrection, as some of the contemporaries would have preferred people to believe. In fact, these encroachments were predominantly hastily erected dwellings that joined with an established peasant class of smallholder and cottager. But to a large degree, it served the personal interests of those talking about the forest communities, and indeed the officials broadcasting tales of villainy and pointing the finger of suspicion at the commoners were not quite so blameless themselves when it came to law breaking. And part of the reason that John West's animals had been maimed so maliciously was because he was employed by and was acting for one of the forest's worst known corrupt officials, Joseph Hinksman, the very same Woodward who had written to complain to the Lord Warden about the men of Wood Green. Now, animal maiming was an act of violence, and it was committed against livestock such as cattle, pigs, horses, poultry, but it could also include cats, dogs, deer, and even fish. It's a clandestine operation that involved brutality against the animal, such as stabbing, hocking, mutilating, shooting, breaking bones, dislocating joints, or poisoning. And these incidences of animal maiming were not random acts of aggression, but they were premeditated and specifically directed at an individual, and were undertaken as a form of punishment or petty revenge, with the animal acting as a proxy for its owner. So it was symptomatic of a breakdown in social relations and closely associated with other forms of antagonism and rural protest. And while the violence was directed at individuals, the acts had the broad support of the populace. Indeed, animal maiming was one of the everyday responses of a dissenting rural worker. Now, this is not to suggest that these acts were a daily occurrence, but they were readily available tools in the protest and punishment arsenal of the rural poor. Potentially its use could have been far more widespread, but it does not seem to have been documented unless it was accompanied by a corresponding incident or incidents, such as threatening letters, the breaking of enclosures, or incendiarism. And this was certainly the case in the New Forest, which recorded a concerted campaign of violence and intimidation orchestrated against the Lord Warden and particularly his officers. And these were the men who were the most accessible targets for campaigns of protest or punishment because they lived among the disgruntled and the offended. So the correspondence we have from this man, you may remember him from yesterday, the Duke of Bedford, Lord Warden, his stewards, estate manager and officers were passed by the Bedford estate to the Hampshire Record Office. And so, and these provide some interesting information. Not just about the complexities within the rural communities, but also the disagreements between the 2 branches of the Forest's administration. Indeed, in many cases, it was a senior forest official, such as the Deputy General Surveyor, who opposed the reforming agenda of the Lord Warden and orchestrated the reported acts of violence, including animal maiming, against his keepers and tenants. In this period, the forest was no longer used as a hunting venue, but it was still managed as one. Its administrative system encouraged the exploitation of the forest resources by remunerating employees in timber and venison and allowing officers to manipulate audit processes or to sell Crown property for personal gain. Many of the appointments had become, office appointments had become sinecures, which attracted perquisites such as timber, grazing, deer or land. And some of the officials treated the forest as their own private country estate and the keepers as their servants. So whilst at the other end of the scale, you've got the King's officers who were believed to be involved in large-scale embezzlement. So the Deputy Surveyor General, the Deputy Woodward and Purveyor of the Navy would all be accused of corruption in this period, and their dishonest example would prove a model of behaviour for some of the junior officers in the forest. And John Wise reflected that the forest was robbed under every pretext and encroachments were made by those whose business it was to prevent them. It was also a clash of personalities and agenda that precipitated the troubles in the New Forest during this time, when John Russell was made Lord Warden of the New Forest. He stated that it was his aim to restore this forest for ages to come, and enable it to flourish perpetually, a large quantity of the finest timber for the Royal Navy, and a beautiful forest for His Majesty's pleasure and service. At the same time, he was constituted First Lord of the Admiralty, and this appointment was one that was clearly intended to improve the administration of the forest for the development of royal timber. Now, he was offered one John Phillipson on the board of the Admiralty, and Phillipson was regarded as an able administrator, a man of business. But he had his background was in packet boats, which were the mail craft that took freight transport in Harwich. And Bedford refused him on the grounds that he was not quality enough. So Phillipson was offered another government post. He was offered and accepted the post of Surveyor General of Woods and Forests. So this put an already strained relationship of Bedford and Phillipson firmly on opposite sides of the Divisum Imperium, which was the divided jurisdiction that separated the two official departments of the forest. So while the Surveyor General was answerable to the Exchequer and liable for the sale of seasonable woods, Lord Warden remained accountable for the preservation of His Majesty's venison and vert. So these divergent duties brought the Surveyor General and the Lord Warden into direct conflict, with very little chance that they or their officers would work constructively together. So upon his appointment, the Duke of Bedford turned his attention to improving the uneconomic operations of the forest and curtailing the unlawful activities of the shadow economy and the widespread corruption of forest officials. In the year following his appointment, presentments were made to the grand jury that it stressed the issues facing the New Forest, including encroachments, a breakdown of forest law, vast numbers of colts and hogs, grazing without rights, turf cutting without proper control, and tree stealing. Tensions were running high as the keepers were instructed to execute Bedford's orders. And in a boundary dispute in 1747, forest keepers met with an abundance of cursing and swearing from a gang of men led by James Perkins, a notoriously bad-tempered man. And the keepers were forced to acquiesce. And Charles Coleman, the Deputy Surveyor General, was in charge of establishing the boundary, but it was felt by Bedford's men that he'd tipped off Perkins and his band of banditti of deer stealers to oppose the officers, and was afterwards accused of calling a multitude of people together for the purpose, which could answer no purpose but to raise a mob and render the inquiry abortive. This was a clear demonstration that Phillipson's officers felt they were able to oppose and frustrate Bedford's keepers. Nevertheless, by 1748, the Deputy High Steward was able to announce that since the wardenship of my Lord Duke of Bedford, 100 offenders or more have been indicted and convicted of sundry offences. Now, there was also a boundary dispute, tenancy dispute in New Park in 1749. Charles Coleman wanted to keep his preferred candidate, who was already in the New Park, whereas Samuel Miller, who was the Lord Warden's High Steward, wanted him to go because he said he wasn't a proper tenant. So in 1750, Miller wrote to Robert Butcher, the Duke of Bedford's agent, to explain that a new tenant, Mr. Gulliver, who'd moved in, has lately had a bullock killed in the park worth about £66, and Robert Keeping, the previous tenant that had the park last summer, is very much suspected of committing that piece of villainy, but they cannot bring sufficient proof against him. And the loss of these animals caused their financial hardship for the owners, and they were incidents that were taken very seriously. And so Mr. Gulliver was described as a man of very good circumstances, and that acquired by industry, making him an ideal tenant. So the Duke of Bedford responded by offering a reward for information about the person or persons concerned in the killing of Mr. Gulliver's beasts. Things moved on apace when the Duke of Bedford decided to order an investigation into certain forest officials, including Charles Coleman, the Deputy Surveyor General. And so in a letter dated 1751, Samuel Miller, the High Steward, wrote, I don't know if you can read that, Messrs. Coleman, etc., are very close in these proceedings and carry it with very high hand, threatening all those who have given informations against them, and says that his master, Mr. Phillipson, and others will take care that they receive no harm. So not only did Coleman and the other officers believe they'd be safe from prosecution for their maladministration, but they positively encouraged others to take vengeance on the Lord Warden's men. So while the tensions between the two branches of administration escalated, it was the Lord Warden's keepers on the ground, living in the forest lodges, who found themselves targets of intimidation, which included having their animals maimed. So James Macy gave a deposition to the conspiracies in 1752 and said that he'd been in the company of a group of men who conspired to kill and destroy a horse or mare belonging to Mr. Samuel Miller. So the men met together with other Confederates and with a gun went to kill the horse, only to find it had been removed from its field several days before. So then the men decided to make cause and occasion a general conflagration and destruction of His Majesty's timber and wood and cover in and throughout the forest. So they were going to set the forest on fire. Nevertheless, prolonged and excessive wet weather foiled their plans in this too. So the men then expressed themselves to be offended and affronted by the underkeeper of Irons Hill Walk for obeying and executing the orders and directions of the Lord Warden, who'd said that he wanted all the pigs and hogs that were there unlawfully to be impounded. So it was decided that if the underkeeper did not desist from impounding the hogs, that the gang would shoot and kill all His Majesty's deer in Iron Hill Walk. Now, these acts were calculated not only to instill psychological fear, but served as a warning to those in similar positions of authority. So here you see a letter from Benjamin Langford, who was the underkeeper at Castle Malwood. And in 1753, he complained unhappily of being surrounded by a nest of pilfering people, more than there are in any two walks of the forest, and was keen that His Grace the Duke of Bedford will not think me negligent in my duty, for I never did nor ever will connive at any offence, but present to the forest, to the authorities, all I can discover. So the keepers in the lodges regularly patrolled areas, and it could be an isolating experience and a very vulnerable one. But Langford was at pains to state that neither am I under any obligation, nor will be so, to any of the inhabitants around me. I wish it was possible for you to know how many and the nature of them, and the care and pains I do take to detect them. So occasionally, an underkeeper was tempted to wink at a poacher and perhaps turn a blind eye to criminal activity, or even collude with them. And the records indicate that perhaps Langford was in this category and protested his innocence too much, because for those underkeepers who did perform their duties diligently, as in the case of John Throckmorton, the consequences were intimidation, brutality, and even death threats. John Throckmorton was underkeeper of Castle Malwood and was systematically targeted for abuse over a period of 3 months. From the length and timescale of the campaign and the number and variety of incidents, there were a multiple number of perpetrators, and this was no petty revenge attack. So in the newspaper, there was a newspaper article in 1753 which reported that John Throckmorton hath received 2 incendiary letters from persons unknown, threatening to burn his house and to murder him and other persons belonging to him. And further to that, a gun was fired into one of the windows of the said John Throckmorton's house. So once again, his servants signed an affidavit outlining some of the incidents, which included posts, rails and pales being pulled down and broken, 10 brace and upwards of His Majesty's deer in the said walk of Castle Malwood were being maliciously hunted, coursed or driven away out of the walk. And further incidences of animal maiming occurred over the next 3 months, which involved a cow that was privately and maliciously hurt, lamed and her shoulder slipped and dislocated, 2 dogs that were privately and maliciously poisoned, and a horse that was privately and maliciously hurt, lamed, and its hurl bone slipped out and dislocated. Apparently the hurl bone is located in the hip area. And this campaign of violence was allegedly waged by a number of people, including several women, and one Catherine Hobbs was heard to declare that John Throckmorton and 2 of his servants would have their brains knocked out and would be killed, or words to that effect. So a pardon was widely advertised, except for the person who actually fired the shot into the house, and the Duke of Bedford also promised a reward of £50. Unfortunately, there's no other information that I can give you to say what actually happened. Now, in these incidents, the greatest protection against sabotage would be for the local population to believe in the benevolence and justice of their landlords and magistrates. But there's little evidence that the inhabitants of the New Forest found such generous qualities in the Lord Warden and his officers. And indeed, his reputation was deliberately damaged and disgruntled by forest officers who were ready to say and do anything as might reflect upon your Grace's good measures and intentions to preserve the forest, or to cast an odium upon every good design of your Grace. So this campaign of demonisation, you see these sorts of things on social media today, they're nothing new, was helped to fuel acts of protest and punishment that were meted out to the Duke of Bedford's men. Now, his correspondence shows that he was genuinely committed to restoring the New Forest to its former glory. And he did make some progress until his death in 1771. Though it's clear any gains were hard won and achieved in the face of organised and aggressive opposition. So while historians have observed the use of animal maiming in rural societies as a form of covert punishment and protest, together with breaking of enclosures, destroying timber plantations, burning hayricks, and even poaching, it's generally categorised as a tool of the rural poor. However, the Duke of Bedford's correspondence reveals the involvement of senior officials in encouraging or even coordinating the series of attacks against the Lord Warden's men. And many instances, though local people perpetrated the acts, the use of animal maiming as a tactic for protest and punishment seems to have been encouraged by high-level members of the Forest's administration, including the Deputy Surveyor General. Maiming remains an area of historical study that's received little academic attention, but one that could potentially offer further insights into the history of rural protest, crime and punishment. Thank you.